In this video, we're going to talk about beneficial fungi. So these are the good fungi. So let's start by talking about the beneficial fungi that is involved in these processes of baking and brewing and cheese making and winemaking. So yeast, remember yeast are unicellular living fungal organisms. And yeast go through this process of fermentation. And fermentation is a form of anaerobic respiration. And during this process, yeast take an organic compound, usually something like glucose, and they can break down that glucose in order to create ATP, which the organism needs to survive. As a byproduct, they also produce ethanol, which is alcohol, and carbon dioxide gas. Now, we as humans, we kind of take advantage of these byproducts. So in baking, the yeast that we put in dough to help it rise, it's actually the carbon dioxide gas that is produced that causes the dough to kind of fluff up during that rising process. The ethanol or the alcohol is used in brewing beer and in producing wine. It's also used to make kombucha. Additionally, some cheeses are made with the help of yeast. So this cheese right here is a blue cheese. You can see this kind of veining throughout the cheese that's kind of a bluish, like a dark bluish color. And that's actually a fungus that's growing in the cheese, and it helps to give the cheese its distinctive taste. Some fungi are edible, and the edible fungi provide us with things like nutrients and energy. Now, not all fungus or fungi are edible. Some are toxic and will kill you. But here are some examples of ones that are safe to eat. We have our morels, which you can see in this picture here, portobello mushrooms, chanterelles, and then we've got our button mushrooms over here, which are also really common. Fungi also can produce some medications that are helpful to plants and animals. So for example, some fungi can produce some of the antibiotics that we use clinically to treat bacterial infections. The first antibiotic discovered, which was penicillin, was actually discovered kind of on accident when a scientist was growing bacteria in a petri dish, and the petri dish became kind of infected with fungus. And the scientists noticed that the fungus was actually killing off the bacteria. And that ultimately led to additional studies that led to the kind of discovery of antibiotics, and more specifically, the antibiotic that we now call penicillin. Cephalosporins are another class of antibiotics that are also produced by fungi. Fungi also produce some compounds that can be used for drugs other than antibiotics. So some examples include cyclosporin, which is an immunosuppressant, ergot alkaloids, which can help stop bleeding, and psilocybin. And psilocybin especially is a really interesting compound. Psilocybin is a hallucinogenic, and you might be familiar with it because it's associated with magic mushrooms, which are these mushrooms that people take kind of as a drug in order to get high and kind of hallucinate. And it used to be really kind of connected with hippies and counterculture, and so it was kind of shunned by society and the medical field. However, there's been kind of a resurgence of research that's actually looking into psilocybin as a way to treat some different mental health disorders. There's some legitimate medical research groups, including Johns Hopkins and Rutgers, that have these research studies going on looking at psilocybin and other hallucinogenics like LSD as a way to potentially treat things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, etc., etc. Fungi can also be involved in bioremediation, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about prokaryotes, because things like bacteria are also involved in bioremediation. So bioremediation is where essentially living organisms are used to help break down oil and other kind of toxic compounds. So if there's like an oil spill, scientists can actually go out and kind of treat the area with particular fungi and bacteria, and those organisms can go in and break down the oil and pick up some of the toxins and heavy metals to keep them from basically spreading out in the environment. Fungi are also beneficial as research organisms. So oftentimes bacteria is used in research, and that's because bacteria can, for the most part, grow easily in culture, or at least some bacteria, and they have a short generation time and they reproduce quickly. So fungi are kind of similar to bacteria in those ways in that it grows easily in culture. Remember, in culture, we're just talking about growing in a lab. And fungi have a short generation time and reproduce quickly. And what this means is that we can see changes in fungi as they reproduce quickly over a shorter period of time than if we were to study humans. Humans take, maybe 20 years to produce offspring, and then the offspring have to grow up in order for us to maybe see some different kind of evolutionary genetic changes occurring. But in fungi, we can observe this much faster. One reason why fungi are better than bacteria for studying things like humans is because fungi are eukaryotic, whereas remember, bacteria are prokaryotes. So eukaryotic, remember, humans and other plants and animals are also eukaryotic. So fungi are actually closer related and more similar to humans, plants, and other animals than bacteria are. So we can use fungi to study eukaryotic structures and functions and genetics and get a closer, more similar idea as to what could be happening in plants and animals. So fungi are often used in genetics research and used in things like biotechnology to create recombinant genes. A recombinant gene is just where a gene from one organism is inserted into the genome of another organism. So it could be that a gene from a plant is inserted into the genome of a fungus, or it could be the gene from a fungus is inserted into the genome of an animal in order to change the genetics of the organism. It's also more ethical to research fungi as opposed to animals because fungi are not sentient beings.